So in this lesson, we're going to look at controlling CSS layout without using something like flex or grid, just using the box model that is present on an HTML page and with HTML elements, and just manipulating things like padding and margin and positioning, relative versus absolute or fixed positioning, and using those sort of controls to manipulate the way things are appearing on the page and where they're appearing. So as a rule, I don't like to use box model for styling. I much prefer to use something like CSS or Flex, because you'll learn, I think, by the end of this lesson how when we style this way, it's extremely brittle, meaning that it's broken easily by things like changes in the elements on our page, or adding new elements or taking elements away, or resizing our browser. All of those things can break our style when we're using just the box model to position things on the page. When we use Flex and grid, we have a responsiveness sort of built in to those things, and so they're not brittle like what we're going to do right now. But it's important to understand what we're going to go over today, because there's lots of it out in the wild. Number one, you'll come across this all the time, positioning and layout done this way, and because sometimes it is appropriate to use some of these things, okay? Sometimes we'll use them in conjunction with CSS and grid. We might have, some things that we've got to set some margin or padding on specifically, or we might want to use, some particular kind of positioning to put things on the page in a particular way. So it's still relevant, it's still practical to understand, but I would never style the way, a page completely the way that I'm going to show you right now. Okay, so this is what we're going to do right now, is just a learning tool to understand these properties and how applying values in these properties affects what you see on the page. Okay? This is CSS. This is using CSS to determine the layout of items on the page, and doing it without using something like Flex or Grid. Okay, so just using kind of vanilla layout controls. All right, so we make sure that we understand them. So it's important to understand these before you use something like Flex or Grid, because underneath all of this is being applied. It's just sort of hidden from you when you use something like Flex and Grid. All right, so we all have the repo ready to go. The code is up in VS Code, and we've got live server running. Okay, so the first thing we have to understand is the box model. Block elements. So what are block elements? Somebody tell me what a block element is. What's a block element? Give me an example of a block element. Paragraph is a block element. Div is a block element. Okay, block elements take up the whole horizontal space. Okay, so something like an anchor tag isn't a block element, right? If we put an anchor tag and you put something next, underneath the anchor tag in your HTML, it's going to show up right on the side of it by default. The anchor tag doesn't take up the whole horizontal space. So a block element takes up the whole horizontal space. An image is not a block element.
Yeah.
An image.
Images next to one another.
An image tag. Look it up for me, Glenn. Yeah. So we can look up with a quick Google. Okay, so paragraph, header tags, unordered list, ordered list, horizontal rule, block quotes, address. Also some semantic things like sections, asides, those are block elements as well. Divs are block elements. So you can look for yourself and make sure, you can always check and see, is this element a block element or an inline element, and it will determine how it displays on the page relative to the other elements on the page. So when we have a block element, it adheres to the box model. It's rendered in this box model. And the content, so what's, sort of between the open and close of that tag, is going to appear in the middle section here. And then we can set padding and border and margin to create space around that thing. Now, border is, not just space, but it has color and it has size and it has style, so we can set those things for border. But padding and margin are space, and then it's really hard to see on this. Well, it's easier to see on that screen. We can also refer to the top position and the left position and the right position and the bottom position in order to control where this element is placed on the page, okay, relative to the other things on the page, generally speaking, but we'll get some more into that.
Our RE image blocks, they're not, unless they're larger than the 100% of the screen size, then it'll just, the next element will just break to the new line.
Okay.
But most
Yep.
of the time I guess you'd have paragraphs and headers next to them anyway, so they'd automatically create a new line anyway.
Yeah, a lot of times they do, yeah. So sometimes though you want an image to be on the same line as some, some text. So there are ways to do that. All right, so border. Let's look at border first. Border is the edge around the box, and border property values are specified with this border attribute. We can also refer to just the top, bottom, left, or right of the border with those other attribute names. So border dash top, right, bottom, or left if we just want to set style properties for just the top, right, left, or bottom. Or we can also refer to the individual style attributes for border. We can refer to those specifically. So by default, if you just say border, then what you specify first is width, and then style, and then color. And then so if we say border, 2 pixels black, 2 pixels solid black, then that's going to create a 2 pixel solid black border around all 4 sides. If we said border top, 2 pixels solid black, then we would just have a black line across the top that's 2 pixels, okay? If we could just say border width, and we could just set border width individually, and or just border style or just border color. So there are different ways that we can specify it. Yep.
So if you're just setting width,
Mm-hmm.
it'll work it out, style.
Yep.
If you have nothing written for width, it'll recognize what style is the
So
certain thing.
instead of saying just border, where we can, so border is a way that we can specify everything at once,
Okay.
right? But if we just want to specify style, then we can use the border style attribute
Okay,
instead.
that's the first.
Mm-hmm. So instead of saying border colon, we'd say border style colon.
Okay.
That's right. So let's just have a play with it. So in the files that you've got, so you're going to be modifying the CSS. Add a 3 pixel solid border that's red to the blue section, and 5 pixel dotted that's black to the yellow, 3 pixel solid black to the top and bottom of the red section. And if you need to look back at the documentation, there's a link to the documentation. Okay, if you give it a try and you aren't really sure what to do, or if you're looking at the slides on your page, you can go back one page and remind yourself the order that those attributes are specified. So while you do it, I'm also going to do it, but you look at your screen and
And just
then
spaces between no commas or anything.
just spaces.
Sorry.
That's right. That's right. It's exactly right. Just spaces. So remember that it's width, style, color. Width first, and then style, and then color, which is the way that I referred to them here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll leave this up so you can look at it actually, and then I'll just do it real quick after. And if you're running live server, you should see it get updated when you make those changes and save it. You should see it get updated in the browser so you can have a look and make sure it's doing what you expect it to do. All right, so how are you going? Still going? All right. Cool. So I'm going to do it real quick up here on the screen. So somebody read it to me. So in the blue section, it was, what was it?
Border 3 pixels solid red.
Yep. And in yellow?
5 pixels dotted black.
And red?
Border top 3 pixels solid black. And the same for border bottom.
Am I running? Did I save? Oh, there we go. Okay, you have to save. I can't tell you how many times I've been like, why isn't it showing? And I'm like, oh, I didn't save. That's why. Okay. All right, is anybody struggling with that? So notice that the border adds to the size. Okay?
The dotted one.
It does. Is the dotted one, is it bigger?
Yeah,
It is.
It's 5
Right?
pixels.
2 pixels bigger. So when we add a border, we're going to add to the size of our element, and we have to consider that. This is one of the reasons that this kind of styling is brittle, right? Because, you know, we add a border, and suddenly if we're like, if we're trying to position things really specifically, maybe we've overrun something, you know? So that's something that you have to realize, is that the border adds to the size of the content. Okay? Any questions about border? All good? Sweet. Now let's talk about padding. So padding is between the border and the content. Okay? And we can specify it in a few ways. So we can just use padding in one size element, and it'll be applied to all 4 sides. So if we said padding 10 pixels, and that's all we said, then we'll have 10 pixels of padding around the top, bottom, left, and right. Or we can say 4 different measurements, and the order is always top, right, bottom, left. That's the order, okay? So if we said like 2, 10, 5, 4, then it's going to be 2 on the top, 10 on the right, 5 on the bottom, 4 on the left, okay? Or we can give 2 measurements. If we give 2 measurements, the first measurement's for the top and bottom, and the second measurement is for the left and right.
That's nice.
Okay? So sometimes that really comes in handy, because we want the padding on the top and bottom to be the same, and on left and right, to match, but maybe we want those to be different. Okay? Or we can specify each one individually. Instead of saying padding : we can say padding top, padding left, padding bottom, padding right, and specify them individually with one size. Okay? So those are our choices with padding. And this is just an example to show you if we specified, top, right, don't do this. This is ridiculous. But this is just to show you that that's it's always that order, always top, right, bottom, left. So it's always going clockwise, starting at the top. Okay? So let's try it. We're going to add 50 pixels of padding on all sides to the blue, 80 pixels of padding to the left and right, and 40 pixels to the top and bottom on the yellow, 20 to the top and bottom of the red. So give that a try. So I wrote it backwards for the second one. So remember the first size is top and bottom, and the second one is left and right, but I wrote it the opposite way.
To be tricksy. You tricked
I can't remember if I did it to be tricky or not. It is tricky though.
Whoa. That surprises me. I think it would be the gaps. That's the other thing. That's the margin. I see now. Okay.
It's really good though to get this, you know, to
Yeah,
just
you have
like to
that.
do it and to see it, and
Yeah.
then you remember and you understand. Yeah.
And then you just use a
Not this.
CSS framework and never touch it.
And never worry about it again. That's right.
Although, hang on, are you marking the next thing? Because it could be really fun to do this for you.
Well, like, that's the thing. I have to check the rubric. Are we supposed to be doing it all in SAS? Or
No, there's no requirement in the rubric. I just made it a requirement for my class.
Right. Okay. I would prefer if everyone hand wrote their CSS so that they know what they're doing.
Handwritten.
Look, SAS, you have to
And it's
handwrite
just a
it.
photo.
Yeah, but if
It's just easier to read.
if I see everyone using a CSS framework.
No, don't. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no. I think for the portfolio, you probably should not use a framework.
Yeah.
Okay, it might say in the rubric. I don't know if it does, but you should not use a framework for the portfolio. Look, if you want to update your portfolio after you submit it and use a framework, by all means. But the point of the portfolio assessment is to test your understanding of HTML and CSS, and to practice with it, to get really comfortable in it. And you know, you want to be really comfortable in HTML and CSS before you're using frameworks, because if not, you're going to be confounded by why framework, you know, it's behaving the way it is when you use a framework. So use that opportunity with the portfolio assessment to really practice and explore HTML and CSS and have fun with it. How'd everybody go?
Good.
Okay, I'm going to do it up on the screen. So somebody tell me, Sean, will you tell me what we need? So
Yes, padding 50 pixels.
all the way around?
Oh, yeah. Then the next
And
one
yellow.
is 40 top and bottom, and 80 left and right. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one, padding top 20 pixels and padding bottom 20 pixels.
Okay, so we can just say padding. I'm going to do it this
Okay,
way.
Yeah.
Top and bottom 20.
Yeah. And 0. Ooh, I didn't do that.
Clever.
Change that.
Clever. Okay.
Ooh, that's what the 0. And you don't have to write pixels. That just is a 0.
You can just write 0.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause
You
0
can write pixels, it won't
is the same
hurt.
as 0.
That's right. That's right. So it'll work it out.
Cool.
So notice that padding also changes the size of the box. Okay? Changes the size of the content, the space that the content takes up. Padding is inside of the box, is the thing to know there. The
Yeah.
border and the padding are inside, the margin is outside. Okay?
But the writing isn't.
John, can you just go back to the
Yeah, but
I
the
can.
writing
Yeah,
stayed
so-
the same size.
Yeah.
If you made the writing bigger, it wouldn't go into the padding code.
No, so it would just be
It'd
it
those
would just be
space around
larger.
the outside of the wordies.
Yeah, so you can see how the section 2 has been shifted X amount of pixels
Yeah.
to the right.
That's right.
If you make the text bigger, it'll still start in that
Yeah.
position, but it'll end later because the text
Yeah.
is bigger.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Have you
it's
seen those memes? Like I love CSS and then it goes to
Yes.
the bottom.
Yes.
overflow none. Overflow hidden.
Does,
Overflow hidden.
does everybody understand what I did here with the 20 and the 0?
Yeah.
Okay, so remember, if I give two sizes, the first one is top and bottom, and the second one is left and right. So if I only want to add padding to top and bottom, I could say padding top 20, padding bottom 20, or I could just use padding and put 20 pixel for the first and 0 for the left right. Yeah?
So this is 1, 2, 4. That's what that is.
Yes, 1, 2, or 4.
What I need
That's
to
right.
put the X beside the 0.
Don't have to, because 0 is just 0. It doesn't hurt to put it.
Okay, so that makes no difference.
It doesn't make any difference. If you're using a CSS linter, it'll probably take it off, depending on the linter, yeah. But yeah, you just don't.
So you
Don't need it.
to go left, right, top and bottom because all you need is the numbers that would go in
So if I only give two numbers, the first number is applied to top and bottom, and the second number is applied to left and right.
And if you give 4, it'll go in the.
If I give 4 numbers, yes, then it'll use the first one for top, the second one for right, the third one for bottom, and the fourth one for left.
So that saves you typing.
It saves you
all those
typing.
things.
That's right.
Yeah, it's because you've got.
That's right. So this is equivalent to and it's equivalent to okay, so this is equivalent to that is also equivalent to these two together, right? But for me, you know, being a lazy programmer, I'm going to use the one that requires the least number of keystrokes, right? All right. All good?
Phil's has just decided to not. For lack of a better word, just decided to not.
So what's happening? So you can try, if he's running live server, you can try relaunching it.
Yeah, just everything on the first box works perfectly fine,
Yeah?
but anything on the
Is there a problem in the CSS?
no, it looks perfectly fine.
Does he have too many exercises and saying,
Are there semicolons after each line?
Yeah,
Is he using a Mac?
The file is saved.
Started a war.
Hold on. Yeah, okay.
So here's another thing I don't like about CSS, is if you've got the smallest typo, it won't tell you there's anything wrong, and it just won't work.
So, see how you've created
Okay?
the CSS file, sorry, the CSS folder.
So any mistake that you make, it won't tell you there's a mistake, and it just won't work.
Oh, yes.
And so there's no way to know. You just gotta like go look through everything and try to sort out what it is. It's so annoying. I hate that.
So little changes at a time and show.
Yes, absolutely. That is the piece of advice. Yes. Small change, test it. Small change, commit often. Say again? There is a CSS validator online. Yep. Yep. And there probably is a plugin, an extension for VS Code that's that's a validator that maybe will help you a bit too. But that's going to catch a lot of things, but it's not going to catch everything. So because it's not actually like a language that's interpreted or transpiled or anything in any reasonable way, it's just some kind of weird browser magic that's reading the CSS and applying it. It can be really frustrating as a programmer, when you're trying to work out why isn't this style being applied. All right, margin. So margin is outside the box. Outside the box, and it's space around the box between this element and the other elements that are near it, right, that are also on the page. So it's can be specified the same way that padding is. So the same way, we could either give 1 value, 2 values, or 4 values. It's the same rules, okay? Or we can specify specifically margin top, bottom left, or right. So the way we specify margin is the same way we specify padding. Okay, so let's give that one. Oh, margin auto. Something else, a little piece of magic. Margin auto. If an element has width, the element must have width in order for this to work. Okay? So, well, you have to explicitly give an element width. So if you look at my CSS, section has width and aside has width. Okay? So if you don't give a width to a block element, the default width is it takes up the entire horizontal space. So if it takes up the whole horizontal space, then margin auto doesn't do anything, okay? Because what auto does is it says take up the available space. But if by default you're taking up all the space, then that doesn't mean anything, okay? So if our element, our block element has width, and we say margin auto, just a single auto, what we're saying is we want to center that element, okay? So we're going to center that element left to right, because again, it's about aligning this element on the horizontal axis on the page. But of course, if the width takes up, if there's no width specified, then it's sort of taking up the entire width, okay? So auto will center it horizontally. Margin left auto is the same as like right justifying, because what you're saying is take up all the available space on the left, which is going to push it to the right, basically, okay? So we can set a right margin. If we don't want it to be pushed right up against the side, we can set a right margin of like, 10 pixels or 20 pixels, set a left margin of auto, and it'll push that element all the way to the right and leave 10 pixels or 20 pixels, whatever we set for margin right. Similarly, if we set margin right to auto, it says take up all the available space on the right, and it pushes the element to the left, is what it ends up doing, okay? So, so you can use margin this way. Again, I would, use Flexbox or Grid and not do something like this, but it's important to understand that you can do this. Under the covers, Flexbox and Grid are using margin in this way. You just can't see it. So let's try. So we're going to center the blue section horizontally. What are we going to use to do that?
Margin auto.
Auto, that's right. We're going to put a 50 pixel margin around all sides of the yellow section. We're going to right justify the red section with a 220 pixel right margin. So we're going to push it to the right, but leave 220 pixels between the right side and the edge of the page. Okay? And then left justify the image with a 100 pixel left margin. See if you can work out how to do that. Now sometimes people get confused because they're trying to use this margin auto trick and it's not centering anything, and it's usually because they don't have any width specified for their element. If you don't have width, this will do nothing.
What do we have to do? Margin center or to center the blue section horizontally?
Auto.
Order, margin order.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, no. Image didn't. Oh. The width is 200.
Mm-hmm.
My image didn't move, but it's got a width specified.
Mhm.
I'm confused by why.
It's not moving at all.
We try to.
Did I spell it right?
Did you set a margin left?
I did margin right?
And you also need a margin left.
It is the margin right. It's
Margin
not
right.
pushing it to the right. It's the margin
Look at us learn. Yeah.
They've got to be in the right order before they can.
Yeah, so things that are below something in a style sheet will overwrite something above it. So if you specify something, if
Yeah,
you
it's got to be
specify,
top
yeah.
as well, like they
Oh,
need
no.
to have it up.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
I was just saying that's what changed mine. I just had it.
Okay, everybody okay? Let's, so somebody, I'll do it on the screen. So the first one was centered,
Auto, yeah.
I don't know who did.
and the second one was
50 everywhere, so margin 50.
and the red one is
220.
it's right justified.
Yeah.
No, if it's right, is it right justified? If it's right justified means it's all the way to the right, so we need to set margin right 220 and margin left auto, because that says take up all the available space on the left but leave 220 pixels to the right.
Yeah.
And then in the image,
Does it matter if you do them in the wrong order?
no, it doesn't matter. Either order's fine. And then the image, we're going to left justify, so we're going to set a left margin
Yeah.
of what? 100? And margin right auto. Okay.
So even if you're not using it, you still have to go like margin left.
So because if we don't put a margin left, okay, and we don't even really need to say margin right auto because by default it's going to be up against the left-hand side, okay, but it doesn't hurt to put it there. If we don't put this 100 pixels on the left, then setting a margin right to auto is going to push it all the way up against the left. So when you want to right or left justify something, okay, but you want to leave space between, like here we're right justifying the red section, but we want to leave 220 pixels of space. You have to explicitly create that right margin, and then you can say margin left auto means it'll take up all the available space. So if I make the size of this window different, okay, no matter what, see how it stays stuck 220 pixels from the right hand side, but the left margin changes because I've said margin left auto. So just take up whatever space is there, okay, which makes it has this effect of sticking it 220 pixels from the right hand side of the screen, okay, is effectively what it does. So the same with our image down here. You can't see it because by default it's going to be on the left hand side, all right, so that doesn't change anything. We can see what's happening though when we try to right justify with margin auto. Okay, so the blue is centered and the yellow we've put 50 pixels all around, which you can't really see unless we bring up an inspector so you can look. Now let's just look at what these things look like in the inspector anyway. So here, okay, if I inspect this part, the yellow section, you can see the 50 pixel border all the way around and the padding that we've set up. If you mouse over, you can see those sections. Okay, so this comes in handy when you're trying to debug why it doesn't look the way you think it should. Which is a common issue. I think spacing and layout of the elements is like usually where CSS gets confusing, you know? So this is helpful to use this little box that comes up in the inspector to see where's the space coming from, especially if you don't like color and put a border around, right? So because I've colored it and put a border around, you can see where the content is, how big the content area is. But look, actually the padding, right, is taking up some of that space on the inside, right? So the content's actually only 300 by 150, and the padding is taking up the other space inside of the box. And then we have the margin outside of the box. Okay, so that comes in handy. And then if we right click, we inspect that one, we can see that right now we have 535 on the left, but if we resize the box, that's going to change because we've got the left margin set to auto. So it's just going to take up as much space as is available. All right, so if we resize the box, then that number changes. Okay, but this number is going to stay the same because we set it to a fixed 220 pixels on the right. Okay, any questions about that? All good? Sweet.
I do.
Yeah.
Can you, so you see how there's all different layers, they're called different things, you can't like pad and pad and pad. If you
No.
want different layers inside layers.
Nope.
They're called padding.
Padding.
And margin.
That's right.
You only have one.
That's right. That's it. Yep. All right, now we need to talk about positioning. So this is where things get even a bit more interesting and confusing. All right, so by default, HTML elements use static positioning. If we don't say anything about positioning, then we have static positioning. And that means for inline elements, they flow from left to right as we specified them in our HTML file. So in order. The order that they're specified in an HTML file, they're going to flow if they're inline from left to right. And block elements are going to flow from top to bottom because block elements take up the whole horizontal space. Okay? So the static positioning means they're going to appear in the order that they're in the HTML file, basically. Okay? Static positioned elements don't respond to the top, bottom, left, and right CSS properties for positioning. So we have these attributes that we can specify, top, bottom, left, and right, to position an element. So many pixels or whatever size we're going to use. We'll talk more about size in a minute. Right now we're just dealing with pixels. That's okay. But we can't use top, bottom, left, and right on a statically positioned element because statically positioned means it's just going to follow the flow of the HTML file. We can't control it. Okay? So if we want to control the way that elements are positioned on the screen by using the position attributes, okay, or using the top, bottom, left, and right, attributes, if we want to use those, don't. But you might want to, and it's good to understand how they work. Okay, it's important to understand how they work. That's why we're doing it now. Then we can change the positioning from static to relative, absolute, or fixed. Okay, and let's talk about what each one of those do. So relative positioning means that it's kept in the normal flow. So the where it appears on the screen is going to depend on where it appears in the HTML file. It's in the normal flow, but we can position it with top, bottom, left, and right relative to its normal position in the flow. Okay, so if it's in the normal position of the flow, if it's, right up against the left side, then we can say, okay, I'm going to set it to relative positioning, and I'm going to set left to 10 pixels. That's going to push it over to the right 10 pixels from its normal left position. Okay? And we can use the negative numbers also to move it to the left versus to the right. Okay? So if the normal top position is set to 0 pixels, that's the normal top position if it's in the flow. If we set it to a positive number, we're going to push that element down that number of pixels relative to its normal position. All right? Setting it to a negative number is going to move it up that number of pixels from its normal position in the static flow. So let's try it. Okay, we're going to move the red section to the right of the yellow section using position relative and the top property to move it upwards from its normal position. And then we're going to move the same section. So first try to move it to the right of the yellow section, make it appear to the right of the yellow section. Then try to make it move to the right of the green section using the top property to move it downwards from its normal position. Okay? So in the normal flow, these are block elements, and they're going to appear one under the other. But we can change that. Even though they're block elements, we can use relative positioning to move them so that they appear like they're on the same horizontal line as another block element.
It's like a computer game, isn't it?
It is.
In 1 second, let me get myself water before it's hot.
They want it to the right, or they just have to make the LEDs copy and move it upwards from its normal position.
Okay, how'd you go? Terrible. Are you making it move? Is it not moving?
So you do position relative, then you go top.
Yes.
Amount of thingies is
Yes.
the next. So you do top, colon, Snoopy, and then like negative if you want to go the wrong way, positive if you want to go the right normal way.
Position relative.
Yeah, and then with your semicolon, then you go to the next one, and if we're moving it right and left, you go right.
Yeah, so the first step in being able to move an element outside of the normal flow is we have to set its position to something other than static. So now we're playing around with relative. So we set the position to relative for the thing that we want to move, okay? So once we set it to relative, then we're free to move it with top, left, bottom, and right. So then if I set top, if we want to move it up, right, we're moving it up first or down, up. If we want to move it up, I'm going to start by, then we're going to make it negative. We're going to give it a negative value, okay? Because we're setting its relative position negative to where it is in the normal flow. So that's going to effectively move it up. So let's try 100 pixels and see what that looks like.
Not enough.
Not enough? So in here, because it's overlapping, because I don't have enough space left to right for it to go to the right. So that moved it up a little bit, but we can move it up some more. And this is another thing, right? If you're trying to position things this way, how brittle is this, right? We change the size of our window and things move all over the place. So what people will do when they do this is they'll use some calculations to work out where other things are. And who wants to do that? And who wants to try to understand that code? So this is why we use flex and grid and not do something like this, okay?
So it's not sectioned into sections.
Not like this. When you use flex and grid, it is. So that's why we do that. So let's try 300. That's, close enough. Okay. So you can see though that when we change the size of this window, it just goes it goes all crazy, So it's still, we make it taller or shorter. It stays aligned with it top to bottom though. But when we move left and right, we just slide across it. All right, so how would we move it down? If we want to move it down so that it's next to the green section, what do I have to change?
Positive.
I have to make this a positive number. Let's try positive 300 and see what happens. Yeah, so it's bigger than the green section too, so let's try 250. 200. So, you know, it's to the right of the green section. Okay, but the point is to see how using that relative positioning and changing top moves, now we can move the thing around the page. It's not stuck in its static position, normal flow. We can move it around if we change the position from static. Okay? I don't suggest doing that, but you can. All right, any questions about that? All good? So what about absolute positioning? When an element has absolute positioning, it's no longer in the normal flow. So with relative positioning, we're still going to be in the normal flow. When we set top, bottom, left, or right, it's relative to our normal positioning in the normal flow. But as soon as we say absolute, we are out of the normal flow, people. No longer in the normal flow. So an absolutely positioned element is offset with that top, left, bottom, right, and it's container block, okay? And it's positioned relative to that container block. So if it's not inside of another container, like if this element that we're moving around, that we're styling, isn't inside of another div or another section, or another paragraph, you know, inside of another containing block element, then its positioning will be relative to the whole page, okay? So in our case, all of our sections, they're not nested, right? They're all just inside of the body, inside of the HTML page. So if we absolutely position any of the elements that we have right now, they're going to be positioned relative to the page. So the top is the top of the page, okay? So, okay. Other elements will act as if it's not there because it's not in the normal flow anymore. It'll be completely ostracized by the other elements on the page. It just won't even be seen to be part of the group anymore. And its position are going to be determined by the top, left, right, and bottom properties. So let's have a play with this one. So let's move the green section to the top of the page over the blue section, using position absolute and setting top and left.
Oh, because yours is up there, whereas mine's over this bit of the blue.
How'd you go? Yeah? All right. So let me just look at where we are now. So the green's there, the blue I've got center right now. So what's the first thing I have to do in the green section?
Make it position absolute.
That's right. And then set the top to what?
100 pixels.
The top.
0.
0. Yeah. We could just say 0 there, but I'll say 0 pixels. And then what? The left? We could do left or right. We'll do left. Let's try 100.
Yeah.
Kind of puts it over it. So you can, so here we could employ some calculations. We have to talk about some other size attributes. We'll do that in a minute. To try to get it like right over the middle of it. We could do that, but again, who wants to write that code and understand it? Not me. All right, and actually because we must have a margin on the blue. Do we have a margin on the blue? Because it's not right up against the top.
Yeah.
Do we have a 10 pixel margin
Auto.
on the top? We have just auto?
It says margin auto.
Right. It must be coming, oh, I know why. I know why. I know why. Let's look at why. Where is this margin coming from?
Section.
How can we figure it out?
The section with height setting? No.
It's not even going to show it to me. There is a margin there, and it's coming from, there it is. See it? Where's that coming from? 8 pixels. There it is.
Sorry, how did you get that right screen up?
So this is the inspector. So I right click and inspect, but you can also Control Shift I, or there's another, isn't there like
Function F12.
a function F12? Yeah, thanks. So this is not something I added. I didn't add that margin. We'll talk about that in a minute. I've got a slide about it. I'm looking for it to tell me where it's coming. Why is it? Oh, wait, here we go, because I'm looking at the wrong thing. User agents. Look at it. Sneaky little bugger. Where does this come from?
So the browser margin.
Yeah. Sneaky browser trying to tell me how I want my style to be, imposing itself on my style.
So does that mean another person who opened it up on a different browser wouldn't have that margin?
Potentially. It might be different. Very sneaky. Don't like it. Don't like it. We'll talk about how we deal with that in a minute. Okay, everybody all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so using relative and absolute together, we can control the placement of an element on another, relative to another element. Okay, the positioning of the absolute element will be relative to the container in which it's positioned. Okay, so one example of doing this is putting a caption on an image. So if we make the image container relative and we make the caption container absolute, then we can absolutely place the caption over the image. Okay? So to do this, we are going to add a paragraph element to the image section. So right now we have an image section with nothing in it. We're going to add a paragraph element in the image section. So we're going to create this nested container, okay? Where the image section is the outer container, the paragraph is nested inside of that image container. And we'll give it an ID so we can style it, so we can position it where we want to over the image. So we'll give it an ID of caption, because that makes sense. And put the text for the caption Anais Nin. She's the person in the image. Does anybody know who Anais Nin is, by the way? No Anais Nin fans in here? That's okay. That's all right. She's an author, French author. She's was popular in like the 50s, 40s, 50s, long time ago. But quite a revolutionary female writer, because she wrote about some pretty interesting things for a female writer at the time. So she's one of my heroes.
Any of her work's been turned into movies.
Yes, there's a movie called Henry and June that is about her relationship with Henry Miller. You know the author Henry Miller? He was an American author. So they had a very long, a very long-lasting friendship. He was a bit of a mentor for her, and then they became really good friends. And he spent some time in Paris, and they spent a lot of time together when he was in Paris. So, and she did write a book about it, and then there's a movie about it. Uma Thurman plays June, who's Henry's wife in that one, and Maria de Medeiros plays Anais Nin. She was in Pulp Fiction. She was Butch's girlfriend in Pulp Fiction. Yeah, it's a great movie, one of my favorite movies. Don't watch it when the kiddies are up. Okay, but good movie. Okay, so you're going to add a caption in a paragraph that's nested inside the image section, and then you're going to use that ID in your CSS to apply some styling. You're going to make the font color white so it shows up against that black background in the image. You're going to make the positioning of the image section relative so that we can absolutely position the caption on the image, okay? So in order to absolutely position something inside of a container, that container has to have non-static positioning as well. So we have to put relative positioning on the image container, absolute positioning on the caption, and then we're going to position the caption 10 pixels from the left side and 10 pixels from the bottom of the image. See if you can work out how to do that. There's a little bit going on here. Mm-hmm.
Images is probably up on my.
Okay, so let's have a look.
It's probably because of this. It's not in the right.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So what we can do one of two things. One thing we can do is just to take that. Just do that.
Oh, right. Thank you.
Alright. How's it going?
Holy.
Fine. This one's a little bit tough. Did you get it? So we'll try to do it together. Let's try to do it together. So first step is we need to modify the HTML. And inside of the image section, so nested in the image section, okay, this is the first important bit. If you don't do this way, then it's not going to work. Okay, so we're going to add a paragraph with an ID of caption. And inside here, we're going to put Anais's name. Save that. Very important to save your work. Unless you have autosave on, then you don't have to worry about it. I don't know why I don't turn on autosave. I don't know why I'm so opposed to it, but I don't. And then sometimes there are tears when I'm wondering why things aren't working. Okay, now in the CSS, what do we need to do to the image section? First?
Position relative.
Yep. And then we need to add some CSS for caption. And why am I using a hash?
It's an ID.
Because it's an ID. Absolutely right. And I want to change the font color, which I can just do like that. Change the font color to white. And what else do I need to do before I can move this thing? Position absolute. Because by default, what's the position? What's the position by default? Static. And I cannot control it with top, left, bottom, and right if it's static. Okay? It's just going to be in the normal flow. And I just want it to be positioned 10 pixels from the left and 10 pixels from the bottom. 10 pixels from the left, 10 pixels from the bottom. Let's see what happened. There. Now, that is not 10 pixels from the bottom, is it? I can tell. Or it's not 10 pixels from the left. One or the other. But that looks like about 10 pixels on the left-hand side. That is definitely bigger than 10 pixels on the bottom. So what's happening?
Do paragraphs have padding built in?
Let's look. Actually, I need to inspect this guy. Margin block start, margin. I believe that right there is the culprit. Who asked for that? Did I ask for? I didn't ask for that.
Is this the name inside of the picture? Oh yeah, I can already tell that. It looks like it took a while.
I changed mine to say -10 because it went down to the right spot.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. What happens if you resize the page though?
Mm.
Is it
Uh-oh.
relative positioning or is it like
It's
inside of the...
absolute. It's relative to the picture.
Oh, so that's okay. We're okay.
It's relative to the picture. And where is this margin block start, margin block end 1 EM coming from? Where is it coming from? It's coming from the browser, and I know that because it says user agent style sheet is where this is coming from. Nobody asked you, Chrome. Nobody asked you for that. Why don't you just do what you're told? So, okay, so that's what we notice about the captioning. It's not 10 pixels from the bottom. So what can we do about that? So we can reset the margin and padding browser defaults, and you'll notice that a lot of people will do this. They'll just like automatically have this in their boilerplate CSS that they use. And so first of all, look at that selector. It's an asterisk, asterisk.
Oh, I think that's the right word.
Asterisk. And that means if we put it at the top, it means apply this to anything. Okay? I could put body there because we can see from the style sheet, was it applied to body or was it applied to paragraph too? I can't remember. Paragraph. So it's not just body where Chrome is trying to tell me what to do, trying to infringe on my style. Not just in body, but also in paragraph. So if I use the asterisk, yes. Yes, thanks. If I use the asterisk, then it says apply this to everything. If I put that at the top of my CSS, then I can override anything that I put after that was going to override that setting. So even though I'm saying margin 0, padding 0, it doesn't mean that I'm always going to have margin 0, padding 0 everywhere, even if I want something different. If I specify something different after that declaration, then that something different will take over, right? It will be applied instead, because remember that the order that things appear, the order that the browser reads in stuff, the last thing wins. Okay? We have those other rules of specificity to consider, and we have those other rules about inline versus embedded versus an external style sheet. So all of that comes into play too. But inside of the same file, if that's where our conflict is, the last thing wins. Okay? So if I put this up at the top, asterisk. Then look at what happened up here too. Remember how I had that margin up at the top and it's gone now? And now that looks better. Okay? Yes. So what I've added is just at the very top of my CSS file, this is like a resetting of the defaults that come with the browser, right? Resetting the browser defaults.
Is that how you say it?
Anais. Yeah.
Sorry,
The code.
Sorry.
Yes. So down
Once it runs finished,
caption.
yeah, that's.
So the browser's trying to help us by saying, look, any reasonable person doesn't want their content to go all the way up to the edge. I'm just trying to help you out. I'm trying to keep you from making a fool of yourself, because, if you make a web page and your content goes like right up to here, then, people are going to think badly of you. I'm just trying to help you. But if we are, using our own CSS to style things on the page, then we don't want, it's going to be added. We don't expect it to be there. Is everybody okay there? So we have relative positioning on the image section, absolute positioning on the caption. We got rid of the browser defaults. And so now when we say left 10, bottom 10, we get left 10, bottom 10, and not something else. Okay? All right, so I'm just going to mention normalized CSS. So you'll see lots of people use normalized CSS, and it will include that browser reset that we just saw, but some other things that are considered reasonable defaults that won't interfere with your own style. Okay? So it preserves useful defaults, because sometimes there are useful defaults in the browser, so we don't necessarily want to obliterate all of them, like that margin and padding one I don't particularly want. But there are other defaults that the browser puts in that make sense. So whoever decides what the useful defaults are, I don't know who these people are, but it's normalized is pretty popular, so It normalizes styles for a wide range of elements. It corrects some bugs and browser inconsistencies. So it sort of takes care of some like differences that would be really annoying between Chrome and Firefox. You know, the way your app displays in those two. It kind of, you know, rounds off the edges there and makes it appear consistent across browsers. It does a fairly good job of that. So you can download normalized CSS and include it in all your projects, or you can just point your HTML file to the CDN, okay? Which is the way I always choose to use a CDN. Now, the downfall of using a CDN is that people update the CDN, right? You're pointing to some resource that's out there in the internet, and the way it's specified today could be different than the way it's specified tomorrow. And generally, they try to just improve it. So, you know, the idea is that if they make a change to it, it's going to benefit everybody using it. But it's always possible that there's some quirky thing that you're, you know, when they change it and normalize it, makes something look bad in your page. Like that can always happen. Or if it's not normalized, you know, whatever framework or CDN that you're using. So if you're concerned about that, then you can download it and you know, okay, I've tested it with this CSS. I know it looks good with this CSS in all the browsers, and then you're not using something that's on the internet. But say, for example, there's, you know, a browser bug that gets introduced, right? And then the normalized developers will say, oh, we'll fix that in normalized CSS. Then you would lose the benefit of getting that fix if you download it and use a point-in-time version of it. So there's trade-offs, okay? I tend to just use a CDN because it's easier and because I'm not too concerned about, you know, like having some obscure thing be broken by a change in the CDN, okay? But I'm not building anything that, you know, I'm like, it's mostly just for me and a small audience. So you just have to make those choices as you go along. All right, fixed positioning. So one more kind of positioning we need to talk about. An element with position fixed is positioned relative to the viewport. The viewport is the window, the browser window, okay? Or your phone screen. It's the available space to display the content of the app or the page. So if it's positioned relative to the viewport, it means that it always stays in the same place because it's not positioned relative to anything else in the viewport. It's positioned relative to the viewport itself. So that's why fixed. It'll be fixed in the spot that you put it in. And even if you add other things to the page or you change the size of the window, it's always going to be in that spot relative to the viewport. So it's going to appear to be fixed. So the top, right, bottom, and left properties are used to position the element. So what we're going to do is we're going to use fixed positioning on the aside. The poor aside's been neglected this entire time. He feels really sad. So we're going to give him some attention. We're going to use fixed positioning to put him on the right side of the page, 10 pixels from the, 100 pixels, sorry, from the top of the page, and 10 pixels from the right side of the page. Do a bit of scrolling and resizing after you've done that and see how that element behaves after you've made that change.
That's how you get those fancy fixed headers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to give it a try here. So what do I have to do first?
Position
And next, we want top 100 and right 10. And there's our side, feeling the love. So it stays there. And if I resize the viewport, it's going to stay stuck exactly where it is. Okay, it's going to stay 10 pixels from the right side of the viewport and 100 pixels from the top of the viewport, no matter what I do. Now, I get annoyed by when sometimes they're like little icons for like socials or something that people fix on the side of the page, and then it like covers the content when you scroll. And I don't like that. But it is useful to stick a header. You know, if you want to like stick your nav bar there and you want it to be available or something like that, then it's okay. Just make sure if you fix something that it's not going to interfere with the other content on your page. If your user scrolls, that it's not going to cover over something that they need to be able to read or see or click on. Particularly important on a smaller device, you know, where there's not as much screen real estate. If your fixed thing is covering stuff up and I can't get to it, you know, because if I scroll this way, it goes off the screen. If I scroll down, it's covering it up completely. So just be aware of that. Be really sparing with your fixed, okay? Any questions about that? All good? Okay, so I think this is the last topic. I talked for a long time. I apologize for that. Yeah, it is. All right, so measurements. So far we've been using an absolute measurement, a unit like pixel. There's also inches and centimeters. Those are examples of absolute measurement. So if I say 10 pixels, it's the same, you know, amount of space no matter what. It's 10 pixels. If I say an inch, it's an inch. 2 centimeters is 2 centimeters, no matter what. Okay, those are absolute measurements. And sometimes that's appropriate. Like if we want to position a caption on an image, for example, you know, it's probably appropriate to say I want it this many pixels from the edges, you know. But a lot of times it's not appropriate. So if we look at our beautiful page we've created here, you can see that using absolute sizes means that it's unpredictable how our page is going to look. It's a bit unpredictable, maybe not ideal, maybe not exactly what we were after. Don't necessarily want that red section to slide behind the image. That's fancy, but so this is kind of the problem we have if we use absolute sizing, is that it makes our page really brittle. If we change the size of the viewport or we scroll, then things might not be exactly where we pictured it in our mind when we saw this beautiful image of the website we were creating. So that's when relative sizing comes in handy. So let's talk about relative sizing. So we have some choices when it comes to relative sizing. Maybe you've seen EM before. And EM sizing is relative to the size of the element. Okay? So if we say, for example, if we're trying to size a font, for example, and we said 2EM, then what we're saying is we want this font size to be 2 times bigger than what it normally would be, okay, for this particular element. We could say 0.5 EM, and that means I want it to be half as big as it normally would be. All right, so we can use decimals there as well. REM is relative to the font size of the root HTML element. So because we may have declared a font size for like a div, for example, and then we have other things inside of that div, right, like paragraphs maybe, inside of the div. So inside of the paragraph that's inside of a div, if we use EM, then we're setting the font size, the size relative to the size in the div. But if we use REM, then we're setting the size relative to the size in the whole HTML page, which is likely a browser default kind of thing. So that's the difference between EM and REM, okay? View width and view height, viewport width, viewport height is relative to 1% of the width or the height of the viewport, which is a bit strange. So if, for example, we say 3VW, then it's going to be 3% of the viewport width is what we're saying we want that size to be, okay? And the same for height. Percentage is relative to the parent element. So if the parent element is another container, then if we say I want the width to be 30%, then it's going to be 30% of the width of that parent container. If the parent container is just the page, then the width is going to be 30% of the page, okay? The available space on the page. So we can use these relative sizes when we are sizing something that we want to be responsive. So if we change the size of the viewport, then it's going to behave in a more, reasonable way generally if we use a relative sizing. So just have a play with those. When we use Flexbox and Grid, they're using relative sizings for the padding and the margin and things that are being added to the elements by Flex and Grid. It's all done with relative sizing. And a lot of times it makes sense to use relative sizing when you're specifying sizes of things, okay, to keep it responsive. I'm not going to talk about floating because I don't like it, but I don't really like, people use floating, but I don't like using floating, so I'm not going to teach you how to do it, but you can go learn on your own though. You can learn about floating. It leaves things in the normal flow, but moves them as far left or right as possible in their container. And you have to set width on floated elements or it doesn't look like they're floating. So it kind of works the way that margin auto works. It's just a little bit different. And then fonts. So there's Google Fonts. Who uses Google Fonts already? Who's ever looked at Google Fonts? Yeah. So there's like a million different kinds of fonts. Not really a million, but there's a lot. There's a lot of different fonts. And Google Fonts, you can look at what they look like, and that's really nice. But you can also select one, and it'll show you ones that look good with it. So these will be popular pairings with that font. So when you talk about typography, I'm sure that Glenn will talk about how, it's generally not a good idea to have 30 different fonts on your web page.
She's wrong. The more fonts, the better. If you can have a different font every letter.
So generally, a couple of fonts is fine. You can use one font for stuff that you want to stand out, like headings and stuff. But for the text on your page, you want to make sure it's a standard font because it makes it more readable. As humans, we are used to reading things in certain fonts. And so when you use some really weird font, then it makes your text harder to read because our brain has to work harder to recognize what are these letters, So use standard fonts. Another thing to be aware of is web-safe fonts, and what that means is fonts that are going to be available regardless of the browser. So not every browser supports rendering every font. Okay, so you want to be aware of that as well. You can look. I also like this W3 page. Oh no, it's W3 Schools page because it shows you the web-safe fonts and shows you what they look like, and also gives you the text that you need to specify for font family. which makes it easy. All right. So if you do use Google Fonts, though, it's very handy because you pick the one that you want, or the ones that you want, by clicking on the select this font. So I can select that one, and then maybe I want to pair it with Lato is another one that I like. And then you open up this little dialog and it tells you what you have to do. So if you want to just include the link to the CSS for these fonts, you can do it that way. I do this, so it's specified in CSS. I would do this, and then I would import, because I'm generally using CSS files in Sass, so I'm going to use the import statement, and at the top of my Sass file I would just put this import. Okay? If you have a style tag inside of your header, you can put this import inside of your style tag, and that will bring in the CSS required to support rendering this font. Okay? But where you actually want to apply this style, this font family, this is what you have to put in your CSS. So it's a combination of using either the import or the standard link syntax, and what you have to put in CSS when you want to apply that font. Okay, so you have to use both of those. And then you can customize it so you'll get the defaults. But if you wanted it, to be one of these other, and it shows you what they look like, if you wanted it to be italicized or bold or whatever, then it just basically gives you the CSS to support those different stylings of the fonts. It'll just kind of come with it. So it's really handy. Google Fonts is nice. I use Google Fonts all the time. And there's some really interesting fonts here, for sure.
What's your favorite?
I really like Roboto and Lato. I know they're really boring, but those are ones that I like. Let's go back here. I also like kind of a plain person that way, though. I don't like to get too wild and crazy with my fonts. You're not going to see me using, let's find a crazy one. I'm probably not going to use Lobster. Maybe as some decorative font, somewhere, maybe. But I would never use something like this.
I was just about to say,
No.
Indie Flower looks like something
Indie
out of
Flower.
space.
It does, Glenn. You're right. It does. I would not do that. I would not use Indie Flower. It's just not my style, right? To use ones that are like that. I wouldn't use Righteous. It even sounds really righteous. It's the Righteous font. I would not use permanent marker. I wouldn't use all caps either, because it just feels rude to me. It's a little bit aggressive. All caps in bold? No, not for me. This? No, I can't read that.
Maybe a little bit of space in between each letter would be bearable.
Yeah, that's you can't read that. Can you imagine trying to read a page of that? You'd be like, what am I looking at?
Spectate before us. Has anyone seen those pictures?
Satisfy.
What is the prose that's going on in the background? It's nice.
It is nice, right? Yeah.
It's just excerpts from
Waves flung themselves at the blue evening. Yeah. There. Oh. Orbitron. No. No.
Don't worry, guys. Half of tomorrow's lessons is just scrolling through Google Fonts.
Google Font. You'll have. Yeah. There's a little bit of everything here. There's some really wild ones. They're just not coming up. There's some really monotone. That is some retro stuff there.
Each color Each
That
letter a
is
different colour.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
being a disco already.
Oh, press start. Yes. So look, have a play. You can see it just goes on forever. Like I'm not even, this is where my scroll bar is. Like there's a lot more to look at here. There's so many. Oh no, rock salt. No, what are you doing with your life? No. Yeah. So you do want to be careful about picking really odd ones because they may not be available in every browser. So you do have to be aware of that. Okay. You wanna have a fallback.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Just show me in every browser.
And you've got this crazy one, Arial.
Yeah.
And because they're Google, they're free and you can use them in
That's
multiple
right.
browsers or-
That's right. Yes. So these are all freely available to use. Yeah. So have some fun. Don't let me stop your creative side. You can be like Glenn and choose crazy fonts for your pages if that's what you want to do. By all means, have a good time. Oh, what? Mountains of Christmas. What is that?
Looks like
And
children's book or something.
yeah. Some of these things are appropriate in certain contexts, right? As long as your whole page isn't written in that. Like, don't do that. An accent, okay? Maybe. Oh man, that's like almost impossible to read. Railway dots. There you go. You can just have fun, You just be looking through the Google fonts all day. All right. I got distracted there. Okay, and that's it. So there are some resources on that last page that are referred to throughout the presentation, just all in one place. So you can have those handy if you want to have a look. And yeah, I encourage you to have some fun. So there is another challenge from the first part, the CSS Zen Garden. Has anybody played with that before? The Zen Garden? So it was in the CSS Basics, where the first challenge was, in the homework section. So the idea here is that you can download this HTML and then you write your own CSS for it. And lots of people have done this. So it's the same content, same HTML page, exactly the same HTML page for all of these different stylings. And they look totally different. So it shows you the power of CSS. Okay? For all of these, the HTML is identical. Okay? Mind-blowing, right? So you can have a go at doing your own CSS and just have fun with it. Fountain Kiss. Oh, I'm intrigued. What is this? Oh, wow.
Ooh.
Wow.
That's very bright.
Wow.
Also, in the canvas, the CSS Essentials,
Oh,
there's also
That's really cute.
taking your original band page and just adding what you've learned to your original page. So if you don't have your original band page, like maybe you deleted it out of shame, or you never did it in the first place, you can. I've made a really simple mock-up, not the one we did in class, like a proper one, and you can just download that and use that as your template, or use somebody else's band page.
So here's the HTML file and the example CSS file. Okay, so you can grab those if you want to. You can just grab the HTML and just write your own CSS from scratch and just see what you can do. Okay? So it's just a way to play You can look at what other people have done and what's possible in CSS. It's amazing what's possible with just CSS.
That robot one had something like.
It had some animation, so you can do animation with CSS. You don't need to use JavaScript to create animation. So that's something else that will get covered, I think, next week, probably as an extra kind of topic.
Even this Saturday, maybe.
Maybe. I don't know. You're very ambitious for this Saturday.
I think we can smash through a lot. Because you've pretty much covered half of tomorrow's content already.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right.
we
Well,
can-
Flex and Grid. Flex and
Yeah.
Grid are a lot.